Hello everybody and welcome back. Hope you're having a very good weekend. And today we're going to look at a gearing replay. Now, a couple of months ago I think I put up a video where I talk about the gunboat playstyle for the USN. And recently I've gotten a couple of questions about how do you play the gearing, considering it's not as good as a Russian destroyer as a gunboat, and it's not a shimakaze when it comes to torpedoes. So hopefully this video can serve as a bit of a refresher, as well as sort of point out what you should be doing as a gearing. Fundamentally, the gearing is a jack of all trades sort of destroyer. She's good at everything, but she's not the best at any one thing. So let's take a look at what the Grey Baron does in his gearing, and I'll point out some of the things that he does right, and of course some of the things that could have been disastrous for him. The very first thing the Grey Baron does is he goes and caps C, which is something that should be very self-explanatory, as that's the closest cap to the spawn, but I've seen times when people actually miss the cap. Basically, the destroyers all go zooming off to either Alpha or Delta, and they forget about C. Always remember to take that first, and you know, one of the other things about taking the cap is it's free experience. You have the base assist cap ribbon, and base captures are a nice chunk of experience, so do it just for the experience gain. Hell, if you're in a fast cruiser you can get there, do it as well. I mean, it's worth it. Anyways, the enemy team on the side heading towards Delta do have most of their ships spotted, and there is a Fubuki and a Des Moines, and those two are actually probably the most dangerous ships on the enemy team, and that's primarily because, one, the Fubuki can spot the gearing. The gearing is a very stealthy ship if you fully equip it for concealment, but the Fubuki can spot it. And of course the Des Moines, self-explanatory. The Des Moines is really scary because now it has radar, and in this version of the game, if you're playing a Des Moines, you really should have radar. Now, I've definitely seen the arguments for having the catapult fighter by saying that the catapult fighter does spot torpedoes, and that is true, but you got to remember that the catapult fighter kind of flies around in a nice big circle, and it only ever passes sort of the critical area maybe a few seconds every 20-30 seconds, so it's by chance whether it spots anything or not. The radar, it guarantees for 40 seconds out to 9.9 kilometers on Des Moines you have spotting of ships. You don't see their torpedoes, but you'll see their ships, and if you know where the ship is, you can make a pretty good prediction on where the torpedoes might be coming from. So if you're playing at Des Moines, it's definitely recommended that you actually get it. Plus, if a destroyer tries to hide in smoke, you really have a very easy kill. So what Grey Baron does first is, while still at range, when the enemy ships are still at range, he sort of takes a look and sees where the common trajectory is, and he fires a nice salvo of torpedoes, creating a bit of a torpedo wall. He does get spotted by the enemy Fubuki, but is very quickly able to get behind a little bit of solid cover, this island, and he falls off of detection for the Fubuki, and the Fubuki falls off detection for him. However, the torpedoes that he manages to get off is going to catch 3 of the enemy ships within that wall, putting 2 torpedo hits onto a Kutuzov, which seriously reduces that Kutuzov's ability to fight, and gets 2 nice additional hits on the Izumo. And that is the thing about the gearing, at least the first step of playing the gearing, is you can play that role that a shimakaze sort of can. You're not as good as the shimakaze, your torpedoes are not as good, but you can zone off certain areas, and ships that decide to go into those areas can get hit by torpedoes and can take a huge amount of damage. So the first step playing the gearing is to play as that area denial ship. Sort of the role that the shimakaze plays, except the difference is that once you've expended your torpedoes on a gearing, you just transition to using your guns. And the gearing's guns, while they don't have the highest amount of damage or have the highest fire chance, the rate of fire on them is incredible, and you can get out so many shots, and with the amount of shells that you're able to get out, the damage is still pretty good, and of course if you can get fires, then it's even more damage. In this particular engagement right here, I don't like the play of either the Des Moines or the gearing. So Grey Baron, in the future, if you see a Des Moines, don't do this, because if the Des Moines is packing radar, you're essentially giving a cruiser with an autoloader the ability to catch you while you're sitting still, and that's not a good thing to do. Still, in this case, the enemy Des Moines doesn't have radar, so it doesn't really matter, and the Grey Baron can just sit in the smoke and pluck away. Because the enemy team plays this even worse. There is just a whole bunch of things wrong here. The enemy team has an Izumo, they have a Des Moines, and they have an Atago on that side of the map. The Des Moines, by no means, should be leading this charge at all. The Izumo should be leading the charge. The Des Moines and the Atago are supposed to be behind the Izumo, providing fire support. So, if you look at the Des Moines, it's just that Des Moines in the wrong position. Overextended by himself, taking all the fire from all the ships, and is basically going to burn to death. The Izumo is way too far behind, and also taking cover behind an island, which is limiting that Izumo's ability to 1 tank hits and 2 provide fire support. So really, really bad plays there by their ships. The Fubuki shows up, but really, really, really late, and just gets punished. And there's really not much a Fubuki can do against the Gearing at this kind of range, as the Gearing's rate of fire is just going to tear you a new one. So Fubuki goes down very, very quickly, does get off some torpedoes into the smoke area, but widespread, just not very effective. Enemy Des Moines in all chat starts to complain about the fact that his team said that they would support him, but they all ended up hiding behind him. And the only thing I would say to that is that as the Des Moines player, you shouldn't be the one to ever lead the charge unless there's a high certainty that you're going to win that engagement. So assuming that you're going to go into, let's say, 2 tier A cruisers that you know you can win the fight against, then you go in. In the event that the enemy team seems to have battleships and cruisers and destroyers, what you should be doing in Des Moines is waiting to see what your team does. So if your battleship says, yes, I will support on the push, then have the battleship start pushing first before you take action. If the battleship isn't pushing, then you don't push. Just a quick reminder that if you're playing a Des Moines, it's your DPM that matters. And if you can preserve that DPM for as long as possible, then it's going to have a greater and greater impact on the game. If your DPM gets wiped out within the first 60 seconds, you really haven't done all that much. So just the thought. Alright, going back to the Grey Baron. So the gearing, once you've taken care of things like the Fubuki that can spot you, and you've taken care of the cruiser like the Des Moines, which has radar, then you can stealth back up again, and you can go back to using your torpedoes, sort of like what a Shimakaze would do, and just become that torpedo boat. And while your torpedoes aren't as good as, let's say, what the Shimakaze has, they're still capable of doing damage and causing flooding. And it's the flooding that's actually important, because if you flood, you force the enemy target to repair, and the minute you force the repair, you wait for that repair timer to tick out, and then you just go back to trying to set them on fire. And then they will burn to a crisp. Enemy Atago gets taken down really, really quickly, and it's just the Izumo left. And this poor Izumo really has zero support now, and it's really his own fault for not actually having helped in the initial push. And so, no sympathy for him as he gets taken down. 2 things I want you to sort of focus on now. One is you notice that there is a destroyer right now around Delta 5, Delta 6, around Echo 5, Echo 6, right in the little center point there. There's a destroyer there. There's a Moskva on the TheGreyBaron's team. As a Moskva player, you're going to eventually have to use your radar to pick up those destroyers. You know where they are positionally. You got to move a little bit closer, light them up on radar, and so you know exactly where they're going to come from. Alright, but before we get there, pay attention to this part. Remember that torpedo that hit earlier and that flooded the Izumo? Now this becomes happy times for the Grey Baron. All he has to do is sit at around 10 kilometers and continue to rain shells down on the Izumo. The gearing doesn't do well at max range, by the way. At max range, the shells take way too long to really get to target. But at about 10 kilometers, the shell travel time is not that bad, approximately 11 to 12 seconds. And as long as you keep it within that 10 kilometers, you should be able to get your shells to hit. The Izumo gets melted, and we go right back to focusing on this little engagement that is going to happen sooner or later between the enemy Benson and the Grey Baron's gearing, and of course this Moskva. I'm pretty confident that the Moskva's radar is actually on cooldown. However, if it was on cooldown, then I have to point out that the Moskva used its radar way too early in the battle. The earlier sections of the battle where the Moskva was further behind and acting more as a support role, there was nothing that really needed the Moskva to use its radar on. There was a gearing in front of him which would have spotted the Fubuki and the torpedoes ahead of time. Really no point for the Moskva to have burned its radar then. However, right here, had the Moskva still had its radar, it would have given it a small advantage to at least know where the Benson was heading and, potentially where the torpedoes might have come from. Even though those torpedoes still might have killed the Moskva, it would have at least provided some valuable intelligence for your team and would have allowed them to deal with things better. So had the Grey Baron, let's say, known the exact position of the Benson, I think he would have been a lot more comfortable cutting through the gap between the two islands instead of taking the long way around. The Grey Baron's taking the long way around because it's the more conservative, safe approach compared to just cutting through the island. The enemy Benson pops up again at around 5.5 kilometers and starts to engage the Grey Baron's gearing, which is a really bad idea if you're in a Benson, just because the Benson's not going to outright win a gun duel against the gearing. In fact, what I would have liked to see from the Benson's actually, once he's taking care of the Moskva, to just head straight south, cut through the middle, and go to C, because C is where the majority of his team is heading. So had the Benson cut down there, they most likely would have capped C, and by capping C and helping his team get C, the Benson could have basically negated the Grey Baron coming over to Bravo and taking this cap for his own team. Furthermore, had the Benson gone to C to help out the other destroyer on his team, the two of them could have made a pretty potent little force and could have done a little bit more to disrupt the Grey Baron's battleship and cruiser that are heading back to the C cap. Instead, the Benson stays here, tries to engage in a gun and torpedo duel against a gearing, and is just overwhelmed by the sheer number of shells that the gearing can output. As you can tell, it is a lot more than what the Benson's able to reply with. With the Benson sunk, the Grey Baron's very comfortably able to just walk onto B cap and cap it for his team. I do have to say that there were a couple of ships on the enemy team that just played terribly. And here's another one of those situations. The Tirpitz on the enemy team, if you go back in the video, the Tirpitz has been on the C and D lines for such a long time without actually going to help his team. Yes, he's got 2 kills, and I know that, but he's in the wrong position. If you looked at the map earlier and you saw that entire push going south, that Tirpitz needed to be there. The Tirpitz needed to be in a position where he could help the 2 cruisers and the 1 Shimakaze push through C. But by not being there, the Tirpitz wasn't able to help his team push through C quickly. And in fact, if you looked at the C cap, the Shimakaze got on, got pushed off, tried to get back on again, and what ends up happening is they just don't get the cap. And by not getting the cap, their initial points advantage pretty much vaporizes, as the Grey Baron's team with 3 caps is able to very, very quickly catch up on points. Furthermore, by being so far back, the Tirpitz is now being attacked by the Grey Baron and he can't really retaliate, and so he takes a whole bunch of additional damage for no reason whatsoever. The Shokaku on his team, even worse, gets caught out in the open, no support, nothing, and the Shokaku is really, really far back as well, and just becomes an open, easy target for the Grey Baron to drop HE after HE after HE shell. And at tier 8, where the carriers don't have armored flight decks, the damage taken is quite large. As you can tell, even with only 2 guns, the Grey Baron's able to output between 1,500 to about 2,500 damage with only 4 shells. And this very, very quickly takes away the Shokaku's HP, and it is going to be underwater. Going back to the Tirpitz real quickly again, take a look. The enemy team, without the Tirpitz helping to push, 2 cruisers and a destroyer gets taken down by a single cruiser and a single battleship, just because the cruisers really can't output enough damage to take down the battleship that quickly. And the 1 destroyer, while it's effective against the battleship, it has a cruiser to deal with, and that makes its life very, very difficult. So this Tirpitz, by being so far back, just could not lend his team any assistance whatsoever, and by the time he finally gets anywhere near the C cap, the point advantage is now massively in favor of the Grey Baron's team, as they're up 950-ish to 600 points, and very soon the battle will be over. To recap the battle overall, Grey Baron played it very, very well. The one thing to keep in mind is now that there's radar, so be careful of Des Moines and Moskvas. Other than that, with the gearing, the primary thing that you have to do is when you're at range and you're still hidden, you can try to be a Shimakaze first by launching torpedo walls and try to get some lucky torpedo hits. Once you've expended your torpedoes, you can use your guns, but do remember to try to stay outside of 9.7 kilometers, as they'll allow you to maintain your stealth while you're firing your guns. Also, really important thing to remember is that if you get a flooding on a target, you know that most likely that target will probably repair, and so make sure that you get your guns onto that target and set them on fire again. All in all, try to remember that when you're playing the gearing, that your job is to be that annoying pest. You're supposed to sit there and just be that invisible thing that constantly either is raining shells or raining torpedoes onto the enemy targets. Finally, one last thing, as a destroyer, do not forget to cap. Cap is essential to helping your team win when it comes to points, and it also provides an amazing amount of experience. So there we go, battle's done. Grey Baron does a very, very good job playing his gearing. Let's take a look at his results. The Grey Baron manages 398,802 credits, almost 400k, 5,064 experience, gets a Confederate, gets a high caliber, manages 332 hits with guns, 5 torpedo hits, destroys a couple planes, sunk 2 ships, which wasn't much, but then as a destroyer, your job really isn't to sink every single ship in the game, it's to actually play your role. Bunch of fires, couple floodings, a whole bunch of base captures. In terms of damage, manages 187,720 damage, and that all is good for 3,376 base experience. Anyways, folks, hope you enjoyed this video of the Grey Baron playing gearing and getting a few pointers about gunboat play, especially at tier 10 with this particular ship. Hope you all have a good weekend. Aside from all that, take care, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.